Howdy folks, it's Wednesday. I guess that must mean it's time to build something. Although this kit only has 4 parts, so it's more a case of it must be time to paint something rather than build anything, because building it is definitely not complicated. This is Charra from Creepytables. I believe they're a Polish model company. They don't have a huge range, but what they do have is very, very good. Here she is. She comes in 4 parts: the hat, the hand, and the head of the snake that's coiled around her, the main part of the body, and the base. And we're going to start by airbrushing it in a black primer. I'm priming in black rather than white or pale grey, because there are some very hard to reach nooks and crannies in here, and if I can't get in there with a paintbrush, or if the bit that I'm trying to paint is too tight and there's a risk that whatever colour I've got on the brush is going to end up on anything next to whatever it is that I'm painting, if I just get as close as I can, the black, since it's going to be in the recesses, is going to act as a shadow anyway. The downside to priming in black, particularly if you're putting base coats down in particularly vibrant colours like red and green and blue and yellow, if you don't want the colour to appear washed out, you really have to apply a lot of coats of base coat. But that's okay. It's not like I'm going anywhere. Before I even start applying any of the base coats, I need to have a good long think about the overall colour scheme that I'm going to go for. So I had a look online for some inspiration and had a look at some of the pictures posted of other people who've had a go at painting this model. I think we can probably all agree that these guys are better artists than I am, but I wasn't a big fan of the colour schemes that they'd chosen. I mean, on some I thought the snake was really good, but I wasn't a big fan of the colour scheme they'd chosen for everything else. On others I thought the hat was really good, but wasn't a big fan of the colour scheme that they'd chosen for everything else. And in all of the examples that I looked at, I didn't see anybody who'd gone for a really sort of creepy undead look on the figure herself, and that was something that I definitely wanted to do. So I came up with a sort of very, very pale blue colour scheme for the skin, a red dress and a green snake, with the hat being your traditional Mexican black with white highlighting sombrero type. So with the priming done, I'm going to get started on the skin. And I'm using Citadel's Blue Horror for this. It's a very, very pale blue, but it's also a layer paint. So I'm going to need a lot of different coats. The coverage of layer paints isn't as good as a base paint, but it's the perfect colour for what I have in mind. And it was going to take a couple of coats anyway because I primed in black, but it's going to take a couple more because I'm using a layer paint rather than a base coat. And I'm starting on the skin and then working my way upwards, if that makes sense. It's like the skin is the lowest element on the figure, and then the hair, and then the clothing, and then the snake. And I do it this way because it's just easier to correct any mistakes. I mean, if I get any overspill from the skin onto the hair, big deal. I'm going to be painting the hair next anyway, and I'll be able to cover up any mistakes that I've made, and so on, and so on. But it's going to take a couple of coats of this Blue Horror before I get to that stage. And about 3 or 4 coats of Blue Horror later, there's the skin done. Nice coverage, that'll do. And I really do like that shade of blue, particularly for this figure. Now for the hair. And I want it to be a redhead. Not ginger, but a very, very deep, rich and lustrous shade of brown red. So I'm applying a base coat to the hair in Citadel's Dried Bark, which is an extremely dark shade of brown. In fact, under these lighting conditions, it's probably too dark for you to see, and it just looks like I'm painting black over the hair, but trust me, it's very, very dark brown. And we're going to be layering that up to a rich redhead colour scheme later on during the course of the video. Next, the roses. There are actually a lot of flowers on this model. She's got roses in her hair, and the base is covered in roses between the various different skulls as well. And you could have picked any colour you like for the roses. They come in all kinds of shades and varieties. Black roses, red roses, green, yellow, blue, purple. I toyed with the idea of purple for a while, but then I settled on the good old traditional red. Mostly because I don't actually have that many purple paints, although I could mix them up. Just blue and red gives you purple. But purple's a tricky colour to mix, so red it is. The base colour that I'm using for the roses is Citadel's Corn Red. It's a very dark, well, not very dark, but it's a reasonably dark and unsaturated shade of red. But I'm going to be applying Mephiston Red and Wild Rider Red over the top of it, increasingly bright and vibrant colours. For now though, I'm not doing anything special, I'm just getting the base coats down. Blue for the skin, brown for the hair, red for the roses. Probably going to be painting her dress in red, and green for the snake. And since I've got the corn red on the palette and the brush anyway, red for her dress. I'm not going with a particularly broad palette here, I'm only really applying different shades of red, blue and green, and I haven't applied any of the green yet. But the detail and complexity is going to come in the layering and the shading. I hope. That's the plan. Speaking of the layering and the shading, I can't really put that off anymore because I've finished with the base coating on, well, everything other than the hat. So green for the snake, very dark green, but we're going to be lightening that up. Similar story with the dress and the hair, and of course the skin. Now for me, it's quite normal for the base coating to go well. I mean, it's very difficult to mess up the base coating. And normally I tend to do a pretty good job of applying washes and shades as well. In fact, often in the past I've applied a wash to the various different colours on a model, and I thought, you know what, that looks really good. I think I should just leave it right there. But of course I never listen, and I screw it up beyond all recognition when I apply the highlights. This time around, there is an excellent chance that I'm going to ruin this model beyond salvaging when I apply the shading to the skin, because I'm going to try something extremely radical. I'm going to use a contrast paint, Citadel's Contrast Aethematic Blue, but I'm going to have to thin it down a lot, which is why I'm also using Citadel's Contrast Medium, which is basically just contrast paint without any pigment in it. It's completely transparent contrast paint. It retains the properties of contrast paint, and that's what I want, because contrast paint is a paint, it's not a wash. When you apply a contrast paint, it paints the surface of everything that it touches. It doesn't just run away from the raised edges the way a wash would. And I want that, which is why I can't thin it down with water, because that would destroy the contrast properties of the paint itself. And I want to keep that. But at the same time, I don't want it to just paint all of the skin in Aethematic Blue, because I like the shade of the Blue Horror base coat. So what I'm basically trying to do here is turn a contrast paint into a sort of combination wash and filter. I want it to tint the blue colour, the Blue Horror base coat with a very, very thin suggestion, just the merest hint of Aethematic Blue. But at the same time, I'm quite happy for that Aethematic Blue to run off and pool in all the shadows and recesses, where it's going to be stronger. I have no idea if this is going to work. I've never even heard of anybody trying to do this, so there were no YouTube videos I could look at for reference. I am very much just winging it and hoping it's going to work. So, fingers crossed, here goes nothing. You can see how it's working. It's still retaining the contrast paint properties. You know, it is flowing away from the raised areas, but it's still applying a tint of its colour to the raised areas in a way that a wash wouldn't. I don't want it going down too thick though. I mean, I've thinned it out a lot with contrast medium. But because I used contrast medium to thin it, and not water, it hasn't changed the physical properties of the contrast paint. It's just made it a lot more translucent. I don't want too much of it going down though, so I'm just, I've dried the brush off and I'm just wicking away any excess with the tip of the brush. But you can see the difference. It's a very subtle difference, but if you look at the face, and then you look at the breast and the shoulder, there is a difference there. And that's pretty much exactly what I was hoping for. I may have even underdone it, but underdoing it is way better than overdoing it. If I've underdone it, I can always apply another layer. If I've overdone it, you're screwed. So, I've done the rest of the skin using the same process, and now I'm going to do something very, very similar using Citadel's Contrast Wildwood paint on the hair. Again, this is a contrast paint. A very, very dark brown contrast paint. And I'm going to be slapping this liberally over the dark brown hair, which, now that it's dried out, isn't quite as dark as it may have appeared when I was applying it in the first place. I could have gotten a similar effect if I just applied a black wash over it, but that would really only have darkened the shadows and the recesses. And I want to darken the overall colour of the hair as well. And that's why I'm using the contrast paint. Because it's not going to just darken up all of the recesses, it's going to make the hair a much darker, chocolatey colour as well. Now it's time to start applying some highlights to the reds, so the roses and the dress. And for this, I'm using Citadel's Mephiston Red, which is a much brighter, much more vibrant and saturated shade of red than the corn red that I've used for the base coat. For the roses, I'm just applying it to the tips of the petals. It's basically just being used as a simple highlight. But for the dress, I'm going to be doing some glazing to blend the different shades of red into each other. At the moment, there's no real blending going on there. I've just blocked out the highlights in the Mephiston Red. You can see how it contrasts with the darker shade of the corn red underneath it. The glazing on the reds is going to be the next step. I've also painted in the eyes, which is, well, it's a step that I normally don't bother with on a 28 or 32mm miniature because I always mess them up. I generally just shade in the eye sockets and leave them in shadow and hope nobody notices, but on something as big as this, you have to do the eyes. And I've just done featureless black orbs. Again, going with the whole undead look. Right, now to get those different shades of red blended into each other with a bit of glazing. So here's how glazing works, and it's a technique that I have been looking forward to doing on this particular figure, because if it's done right, it produces some amazingly smooth blends. And here's how it works. I take that Mephiston Red and I dilute it a lot with water, and then I dab most of it off onto a piece of tissue paper. And the reason we're doing this is because diluting it with water makes it translucent, makes it mostly transparent. But it's going to be too wet. It's going to be the consistency of a wash, and it's going to just flow off where I'm applying it to the model with a brush. So I dry off most of it so that the paint sticks to where I put it. And then I apply that Mephiston Red glaze around the edges of the areas that I've blocked out for the highlighting. It's not going to change the colour of the existing Mephiston Red highlight, but it is going to faintly brighten up the corn red base coat around the edges of the highlighted areas. And as you apply more layers of the Mephiston Red glaze over the corn red and Mephiston Red boundary, eventually it'll become less and less translucent, and you can use that to change the colour boundary. And eventually, if you do it right, you won't be able to tell where the corn red ends and the Mephiston Red begins. Now, for the snake that's wrapped around her neck and shoulders, the base coat was Citadel's Warg Green, which is a fairly typical orc skin base colour. I then went over it with a wash using a shade paint of Citadel's Bealtan Green, which is a very rich, vibrant green shade. Once the shade had dried, I'm going over the top of that with Citadel's Warboss Green, which again is an orc skin tone, but as you can see, it's a hell of a lot brighter. You can also probably tell that I've done her lips and her eyebrows in a very pale, almost violet shade of purple, but I'm not particularly happy with how that looks, so I'm going to be doing some more work on that later. But for now, I'm just going to finish off painting the, well, it's not really a highlight. I mean, technically I suppose it is, but it's a very, very heavy highlight over the scales of the snake. And again, I'm probably going to come back to this later. But the next thing that we need to get done is the hair. So I said I wanted her to be a redhead, and so far she's very, very brunette. So I'm taking the corn red again. I've gotten a lot of use out of corn red so far on this model, and I'm just highlighting Large areas of locks of hair with the red. The red's been diluted a little. I don't want to just put solid streaks of red down. I want to give it at least a fighting chance to be able to blend into the large chocolatey brown surface of the rest of her hair. You might notice I've also done some more work on the lips. I've shaded it with a violet ink, and I've also put some definition into the stitching scars around the sides of her mouth. As well as that, I've done some work around her eyes, and I've gotten rid of that horrible purple eyebrow colour scheme that I had, and I've just given her black eyebrows instead. While that's all drying, we're getting back to the snake. It does look still kind of dull, so I'm coming back and applying another bealtan green shade over the top of everything. Yes, this is the second time I've applied this shade to the snake, but the first time was over the warg flesh green, which was a very dark green and just kind of made it a bit darker. This time it's gone over the top of the much brighter warboss green, and hopefully it's going to add a bit of sparkle to the scales while further darkening the recesses. And once this stage of the process is done, it's time to get to work on the hair, because I do want her to be a redhead, and that's going to require increasingly bright shades of red and orange. And that ended up looking like this. And I kind of like it, but I feel that there's just too much red on the figure. If she didn't have a red dress, and if she wasn't covered in red roses, I think that would be a very, very nice colour scheme for the hair, but she does have a red dress and she is covered in red roses, so I'm going to go over the whole thing again with Citadel's Contrast Wildwood. So this is a dark brown contrast paint, and hopefully it's going to make the hair a much, much deeper shade of red and brown and help to just blend in further the various different colour schemes that I've applied to the hair. Or it could completely mess everything up and undo all of the hard work that I've put in. I guess we're going to find out. I mean, I do like the way it looks, but you don't really know how it looks until the paint's dried. So we'll come back to this later. Can I just say that this hat can die in a fire as far as I'm concerned? Because painting all of that detail, oh, that was not fun. That was not fun at all. But it needed to be done. And I'm not saying it was worth the effort, but it is a very nice hat. Now we just have to take that very nice hat and glue it onto her very nice head and see how the overall finished model looks. And there she is. I am extremely happy with how this model turned out. I don't have a powered rotating stand or anything, so you're just going to have to put it with my finger. There are all kinds of things that I'd never really done before, either at all or much, during the course of painting this thing. I've done some glazing before, but never on this kind of scale. And the blending on the dress, I think, is actually pretty good. I'm not trying to toot my own horn here or anything, but there are a lot of things here that I'd never done before, like trying to use a diluted contrast paint to get that sort of faintly ethereal look to the colour of her flesh. And I've never done as much blending and layering, particularly on the hair, for example, as I have on this model. So lots of things that I'd never done before, or things that I really hadn't had much practice at. I took a lot of risks painting this model, and there were so many points where the whole process could have just gone horribly, horribly wrong. But if you don't push yourself and keep trying new things, you're never going to get any better. And I always say that when you put paint on a model, it doesn't have to be a masterpiece every time, as long as it's better than the last thing that you painted. And when you consider that this is one of the last things that I painted just, 2-3 months ago, I'm pretty happy with how I've been progressing. I mean, I look at this and I still think that the snake could use more work, but overall, I'm pretty happy. And hopefully you guys have enjoyed watching the process, because that's pretty much it for today. Have yourselves a good one. Take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.